episode 18 of The Beardcaster. My name is Scott Sykora, and I am The Beardcaster. Once again, welcome to a podcast all about beards and mustaches and the great people who live in the community. These are the stories and the adventure from the people who grow them and embrace them. There are many interesting stories and situations that follow those of us with facial hair, from lifestyle to competitiveness to everyday life and the world around us. Please join me on this entertaining exploration about these people and hear how they are using their facial hair to be awesome and to do great and fun things. Once again, like I said, my name is Scott Sykora. You are listening to the Beardcaster Podcast. You can find out more information about myself, the podcast, and whatever by going to thebeardcaster.com. You can find links to all my social media there. So if you're interested in hooking up with me via Facebook, not literally hooking up with me, but, hey, chit-chatting, or you can find me on Twitter. You can tweet me, Instagram, you can send pictures, whatever you want. YouTube. Just uploaded a new video on YouTube, which you can find right on my homepage. So I implore you to check it out. Now, the video that I just posted up is in regards to what today's episode's about. I'm not having a guest, but technically I'm guesting myself. So I am the guest today, talking about something that I think is important. Now, what I think is important is what today is. Today is International Podcasting Day. Now, you might ask yourself, what is Podcasting Day? Well, it's number one, what's a podcast? Well, you're listening to a podcast right now. It's pretty much derived from two parts, podcast. Now, it's not someone that hooks a little bean pod to a fishing hook and throws it out in the water to catch a fish. That's a podcast too, but this podcast is more along the lines of pod as it being the iPod and a cast being a broadcast, and it was along the lines of a recorded broadcast that you could download and put on your mobile device, being at the time an iPod. So as Apple kind of, and I don't know the exact name of the person that coined the phrase podcast, but I probably should have known that for this, and I don't, so my apologies. But International Podcast Day is celebrated every September 30th, and this year is the 4th anniversary of that, and I thought it would be really interesting to kind of talk about podcasting and my history about getting involved in broadcasting, podcasting, and kind of explain the podcasts that I listened to that influenced me and got me to where I'm at. So that's what today's episode is going to be about. It's going to be about me talking about pretty much my history and how you ended up getting to me right now. So let us dive into the history of the Beardcaster. No, throw some cool music in here. Okay, so it goes back to probably, I'm not going to even throw years out because I'm really horrible at remembering dates and times and stuff like that. So we're going to go back to, I'm thinking the mid-90s or something like that. And I was a student at Kent State University, which is in Kent, Ohio. And as they say, Kent read, Kent write, Kent State University. So we already had something going against us. And of course, it was also known for the Kent State shootings. And yeah, the Kent was an interesting place to go to school. Definitely the one thing about the time when I was going there, the music scene in Kent was phenomenal. There were so many great bands, and we were always going out to check out music and stuff, and that was really cool. And then I think that kind of got me involved in the radio station because I really didn't know what I wanted to do. I mean, I never even thought about doing broadcasting or anything like that. I was just, hey man, there's a radio station. They were looking for people to, who were interested. So why don't you come in and check out? And they explained to us what it was about. So I signed up to do an internship for a metal show because that's what I'm into, heavy metal. And I worked with a couple different program directors, and I can't remember, but regardless, I ended up getting a show, and I really loved it. I really loved, actually, to think back upon it, I don't even know what I really loved about it. I mean, I got to listen to music all the time. I got to review music. I got to check out new stuff before it was even released. And that was a big thing back then because they were sending CDs. I mean, I'd get free music. I was able to go to any show I wanted to. If I wanted to meet a band, I could. So I think that was more along the lines of why I liked doing it. And that technically had nothing to do with the broadcasting side of it. And even when I was doing a music show, everything was so calculated and set up. Like the clock had all these little colored things on them, and you had to match like a sleeve of CDs, and you would play them at those times. So everything was all calculated, and you had to keep track of everything you played. And then every maybe 15 minutes, you'd get on the microphone and blah, blah, blah. That was blah, blah, blah. And the song was blah, blah, blah. Okay, next song is blah, blah, blah. And you kind of get what I'm saying. But at that time, computers really weren't prevalent at all. And everything was all, you had to load CDs into the disc players, and you had to put carts in to play commercials. And it was just a pain in the butt for the most part. And I got really involved in it, and it got to a point where I was filling in for other people on talk shows. I'd go in and hang out with my friends on their shows, and, it was a lot of fun. So I got a little bit of mic time, but I wouldn't have considered myself a radio personality. And I still don't, because I still don't think I'm a radio personality. I mean, I don't speak well, I guess. I mean, obviously there's people who listen to the podcast who think I speak well enough that they want to listen to me and download my episodes. And once again, I thank you guys for that. So thank you. But I never really thought of myself as someone that someone would actually want to tune in and listen to. So once after my first year of college, I didn't do so good because I was more interested in hanging out at the radio station and going to concerts, checking bands out, and I just, classes were number 2 to that, so it kind of fell to the wayside, and needless to say, the next year I wasn't able to go back to school, and I kind of didn't quite get along with everyone at the radio station either, so that was kind of another downside. So after that, I just kind of drifted off into the sunset, and that was my radio career that I had, and it was always going to be good stories about it and blah, blah, blah. So fast forward, I don't even know how many more years into the future, but I was still involved in the music scene and was kind of getting out of it, but I was getting more into the management and production side of it. So I was dealing with a lot of bands from all over. So I wasn't really playing anymore. I was doing promotion, tour management, and just traveling a lot. So I was getting out there, checking out lots of cool bands and everything. And, I was getting a lot of bands just giving me CDs and be like, hey man, check us out. If you can help us out in any way, that'd be great. So next thing I know, I'm coming home with suitcases full of music. I'd be traveling to the West Coast one weekend, East Coast next weekend, just coming home with all these CDs, checking out all these bands. And I just had this humongous amount of material. And, at the time, I'm thinking I think it was probably around 2009, 2010 or something like that. And podcasting was still new. I believe around 2006, 2007 is when podcasting really kind of started and took off. And it really wasn't the only way you'd really find out anything about it is if you were in your iTunes app and there was a little header or something that said podcasts, and I probably went in there once or twice and checked out some stuff. I remember there being video podcasts and stuff, and there weren't a lot of those, but I mean, pretty much YouTube, and it wasn't anything super awesome. But I always thought, I'm that'd be really cool because maybe that would be a way for me to get back into broadcasting. But just kind of went along my way, was playing in bands, playing shows, and then I was, tour managing on the weekends and just kind of getting out there. And then at one point, I got offered a position to do a radio show with a friend of mine at a different college station, WJCU 88.7, John Carroll in Cleveland. And the premise of the show was unsigned bands. So I was like, that's pretty awesome, because you know what? I check out all these unsigned bands and they're giving me all this material. So once a week, Thursday nights, we had a 2-hour show and I had to provide pretty much material. So what I did was I had all these CDs. I mean, we're talking like boxes and boxes, and I'd go through them, and I literally listened to thousands of CDs and just like kind of was like looking for songs, pulling them out, building these big playlists on my computer, and then I'd burn a disc of what songs I was going to play that night. And then in the meantime, I'd try to set up an interview with different artists that were either coming through town or had done something in the area. So I'd set up an interview with them, and I'd kind of get a backstory about, how did you get to where you are, and what advice would you give a band to help them try to get to where you got and where you are. And so those were pretty much the extent of my interviews. And I really liked doing that because it was cool to like meet the people. And I was once again back to like hanging out with bands, checking out touring bands and stuff, getting to go to concerts for free again. And so I really enjoyed that. In the meantime, as all this was going on, the podcasting thing kind of came up again. And I was working with a promoter out of Kansas City, Adrian, and we were trying to put together an idea to do like podcasting. Because like, once again, it's like I was doing a show on college radio once a week, and I was playing music, but I still had all this other music that I really wanted to get out there. I wanted people to hear, because these bands were busting their asses out there. They were putting out good music and they needed to get heard. And that was the only way I figured that I could get stuff out there was, hell, I'm just going to do a podcast. Adrian and I can figure something out, and, the internet, we can connect and record and play all this music and interview bands, pretty much a internet version of the show I was doing on the radio. And I don't know what kind of happened, but the radio show just kind of disintegrated, for, I guess, lack of a better term, and it just stopped. And the talk of even doing the podcast just became difficult, because at that point I was going out on the road way too much and I didn't have time. I'm flying, I'm editing stuff on flights, and during the week I'm working my day job. So it was difficult to pursue anything more with that. So at that point I kind of sat back and was like, maybe I kind of need to take a break from this. I never really learned the technicalities of broadcasting. I was just someone that was always there to either talk like briefly about what you just heard. I was there to push the play button, push, the fader up and down, and that was about it. I didn't really have any technical training. So I had seen literally in, I think, the 20 years or whatever, I had gone from like the old school, like boards that I really didn't know, I'd never really learned on, to the more digital scene, and like I really knew nothing about. So I wasn't even capable of running a show without having an engineer or a producer with me. And that was hard too, because once everything kind of fell apart, I didn't know what to do. So I just kind of went back home and sat at my computer and just continued listening to stuff and thinking about what I could do that I never did. So then that leads me to, I'm thinking like podcasting still, it's there. There's a seed planted. And at the time, between touring, working, and all this stuff, I was also in a band, and we were called American Rockstar. And I will put a link up to this specific episode in the show notes. So all you need to do is, wherever you're listening to there'll be a list of show notes. You just click on it and it'll take you to this podcast. If you want to listen to it, it's up to you. If you want to hear a little bit more in depth about exactly what I'm talking about at this time, because this is like a time capsule of what was going on in my life, I believe in 2011. And with all this and the radio show and touring and band promotions and all this, just I had a lot going on. And what had happened was we thought as a band, our singer, who was kind of the brainchild of American Rockstar, Dallas Riffle, and he thought, oh, let's do a podcast. Let's do a podcast about the band. And what we'll do is, we'll talk about the shows coming up, and we'll do a little interview with each of the members of the band, get to know them, get to know what they're about and everything. So that's what we did. We did a podcast for American Rockstar. And he took care of all the engineering parts once again. Pretty much we recorded episodes like once every couple weeks. One about, Mark, our guitar player, and then Kevin, our bass player. And then we talked about some big show we had coming up and blah, blah, blah. And we posted these online. And to this day, I don't even know how many people downloaded them. But anyways, I did an episode and we talked for a little over an hour and just kind of talked to me about what I was doing and what I was all about and music and stuff like that. So once again, I get this whole podcasting thing kind of planted in my head and don't really do anything with it. Like I said, at the time I was working with this guy, Adrian, and word up to Adrian out in St. Louis, Adrian Breeden. It's good talking to you, pie eater. But I think him and we tried to record a couple things, and I don't really know if we ever really posted them online or anything. And we tried building websites and stuff. It was hard when you're trying to work with someone who's literally like 800-900 miles away from you. And it'd be so much easier to work with someone who, you had the same ideas, you had the same things you wanted to do, but they never gelled. And even at this time, I really hadn't even subscribed to podcasting. I never really subscribed to anything. I never looked and never really thought about it. Come to think of it, now that I'm talking about it. But after we did that and everything just everything kind of fizzled out, I then kind of decided, I'm like, this podcast, there's a podcast app on my iPhone. I'm just going to hit it and see what happens. And I think that was kind of opening up Pandora's box in a way, because I open it up and I see all these different things and I'm like, wow. I'm like, there's all these different topics. There's all these different things. I could pretty much look up whatever I want to and find something that I'm interested in. And one of the things I was really interested in that I never actually really explored, I kind of did when I was younger, but my attention span for it was a little off. And I was actually, now come to think of it too, because this is also not in my notes, but I was in a band for a brief period of time for a few years called Red Sky Radio. And we were an industrial metal band out of Cleveland. And our whole shtick, as I'm doing the quote unquote signs, was UFOs, aliens, and all. That's what our songs were about. They were about, aliens, abductions. And we actually had these like elaborate costumes that we made, like alien heads and these shiny like outfits and stuff. And we had lights, and it was a big production for the time. And like I said, all of our songs revolved around that, and it was just so interesting. But I never like evolved more into like learning about the stuff other than just superficial stuff, which I knew. So I guess at that time I was like, well, what am I interested in? And that was something I had always been interested in. Something from when I was younger was UFOs. I'd seen like Close Encounters of the Third Kind and Invasion of the Body Snatchers and E.T., all these Flight of the Navigator. Come on, geez. I'm drawing a blank trying to throw stuff off the top of my head here, but I was always somewhat interested in that. So I guess I'm like, let's just type in UFOs, podcast about UFOs. And so I typed that in there, and up comes a podcast called Podcast UFO. Gee, you couldn't even think of a better title than that. Just perfect. It's about what it is. It's a podcast about UFOs. So I subscribe it, and I believe at the time there might have been like one episode up or two episodes. So I subscribed to this, and I listened to it, and I was instantly hooked. I'm like, this is exactly what I've always wanted to listen to. And so I started listening to this podcast, and it got me thinking more. I'm like, maybe there's other podcasts out there just like this one. I should start searching. So, I tried different search topics like aliens or alien abduction, crop circles, any kind of thing you can think of, strange lights. And I started getting all these different hits for all these different podcasts. And the more I started listening to these podcasts, I'm like, oh my Lord. I felt like my mind just was going to explode. Like I was taking in so much information about something that I'd always wanted to learn about. And, number one, our library didn't have these books available. So, living in a small town, and we're talking pre-internet here, I didn't have access to this kind of stuff. So I couldn't get that other than, whatever was on Unsolved Mysteries that week. That was about the extent of like getting any kind of information. So to get to this point where I can just pretty much pick my phone up and type in whatever I'm thinking about, and all these podcasts pop up. Wow. It was like literally like the whole world just opened up. And the other thing is at this time, and still to this day, I got an iPod because my day job is boring, monotonous, and brainless. I'm a window washer, for God's sakes. All I do is clean dirty glass all day long. And it's a mindless zombie. It's horribly kills your brain because all you do is think all day. And I needed something to expand my mind. I needed to add something that was going to, I guess, help my mind grow, not sit stagnant. And by this point, I'd listened to so much music. I needed to hear something and learn something. And podcasting was like, it just filled that void. And I was getting so much out of it. It was amazing. As I subscribed to this podcast UFO, I was really getting into the show and everything. And the guests were great. And he'd have guests on that had other podcasts. And then that would open up the doors to finding another podcast. And I'd like to really send a big shout out to Martin Willis of Podcast UFO. He was really the one guy that really just got his teeth into me, and not literally, but he really pulled me into this world and got me really interested in this stuff. And he had great guests, and he was a newer guy too, in podcasting. I believe he had a podcast, a comedy podcast at one point, and was doing an antique podcast and all that stuff. But he was new into it as well, and kind of cutting his teeth into it. And I kind of felt like I related with him because I was learning stuff too as he was going along, and I felt like I belonged there. He made me feel like that show was for me, and I just have this special kind of little spot in my heart for that show. And as time grew on, I became a subscriber, and I was donating money to the show, trying to help them pay for gear or bandwidth and stuff like that. And I felt good because I felt like I was doing something. I was like paying for something that I appreciated. I was paying for the value I was getting from him and his show. And I still do to this day. And I don't know how many years and over 200 episodes in, and I still value the product that he puts out. So because of that podcast, it kind of opened my mind to a lot of different things. And because of that too, I started reading more. I was becoming a sponge of information. I mean, like I said, I never liked reading before, but as I started hearing these authors talk about these really weird cases about UFOs and stuff like that, and I apologize for anyone that's listening to this right now who might not be into that topic, but like I said, I'm trying to explain my story of how I got to where I'm at. I started reading more, and I was feeling this like rebirth in a way, like I was learning. My mind was always on fire. I was always thinking about something. And once again, thank you, Martin Willis, for that. I appreciate that. So this being International Podcast Day, even though when you all listen to this, it's not going to be International Podcast Day, but part of one of the things that they kind of promote with International Podcast Day, which if you go to internationalpodcastday.com, you can find out all this information about podcasting, podcasts, and all that stuff. But the things that they suggested for you to do on International Podcast Day was to tell someone what a podcast is and where to find them. And that's pretty much what I'm doing right now. I'm explaining, I'm really talking with my hands today, but I'm trying to explain to you you obviously all know what a podcast is by this point because you're listening to me right now, unless you're listening streaming online. And then that's still the same thing because it's on-demand recorded product. So you can listen to this whenever you want. It's just not going to be live. So 20 years from now, someone might listen to this and be like, oh, yeah, man, that's pretty cool, man. And even though they probably don't talk like that in 20 years, they probably talk with their minds. And they're like, so another thing that they tell you to do is to share your favorite podcast with someone. So that's what I'm going to do right now. I'm going to talk about pretty much like all the podcasts that I had subscribed to. I mean, there's tons of them that I've subscribed to and unsubscribed to and have listened to. And, there's tons and tons of them. And if you're into anything, if you're into farming, I'm sure you can find a podcast about that. But I figured I would take this time to kind of explain to anyone that's interested in my podcast how I got to where I'm at and the podcast that I listened to that kind of molded me. So at this time, we'll keep it in the same time frame here. We're, I think, 2011-ish. I feel bad that I can't remember. Like I said, I wish I had a better memory when it comes to dates. But I figured I'd start from the beginning and kind of slowly work through like the podcast that I listened to that got me excited about something. And like I said, the first one is Podcast UFO with Martin Willis. Still going strong these days. And the show's grown. It's huge now. He's got great guests. If you're into UFOs and all the news that's going on, it's definitely a podcast that I highly suggest you subscribe to. In my show notes, I will have a link to the website. I'll have everything listed by their name and then links to the different ways that you can find out more information about them. Upon listening to Podcast UFO, as I type in UFO into search, I come across another show called The Kate Valentine UFO Show. Now, this show, once again, this was an actual broadcasted show, so it was on radio, but they took the content and reposted it as a podcast, so it's just always there. It'll always be there. I think it's still up there, but I don't know how many episodes she did, but she was really interesting. She did a talk show, and she would once again have all these guests on, a lot of the same ones, but the way she would talk and tell her stories and ask the questions, it was just really captivating, and I really liked this show. And it was really sad the day that she hung it up because she pretty much said, you know what, I think I've heard everything I've need to hear to really make up my mind how I feel about this whole field of UFOs and aliens. And I think that's pretty much the point where I'm at too right now. It's so overwhelming at times, and you hear so many of the same people talk over and over and over again, and the stories are the same over and over and over again, and nothing has changed in years. And it's tough to start listening to the same stuff over and over and over again, but you can still, even with podcasting, you can even like hone down more on more specific things. And another example of that is a podcast called Random Alien Brain Droppings with Suzanne Chancellor. Now, this one is an interesting one because this is a podcast, and she hasn't put an episode up for a long time, and I don't even think she had a lot of episodes, but she was really interesting because she was talking about her experience with being abducted. And it was very interesting because I don't know how I feel about the whole abduction thing. I mean, now I feel like might be just bogus, and I think that just from what I hear from people, I just think it's a frame of mind, and you're maybe not going anywhere. You're just having an experience in your own mind that you turn it into a feeling of being taken somewhere by these strange beings. But I'm not gonna discount that. If that's what she feels she believes, then that's what she believes. I'm going to listen to her podcast because it's very good. She's very well spoken, and I really enjoy it. So once again, you can find that one in my show notes. Another great podcast, The Unexplained with Howard Hughes. Now, this English broadcaster has a really good resume when it comes to broadcasting over in England. Off the top of my head, I can't remember, like he was in like public broadcasting and stuff, but had a real interest in pretty much the unexplained, not only just UFOs, but just things that were unexplainable, crop circles, just lights in the sky, whatever. But this man asked the greatest questions. His show was short. It's very entertaining to listen to. That's another good one to check out. Now, this one of my faves, but once again, stopped. And I don't know why. Paul, please bring it back. But The Other Side of Truth with Paul Kimball. It was a really thoughtful, thought out podcast. And it's just, think of it, the other side of truth. It's a different way of thinking about what you think. And that's what kind of opened my mind and kind of got me off in a different direction of, maybe these things that people are seeing aren't really what they're seeing. Maybe it's something else that we haven't thought of yet. Maybe it's something else that there's other ways to think about things instead of being like, oh, it's this. Okay, I've made my mind up. It's this. It's not always this. There's other reasons. There's other explanations that we just don't know yet. But that's another cool podcast to check out. The Other Side of Truth with Paul Kimball. Now, this one kind of opened me up to another. This one might be my top number one podcast that I love, and I get super excited about every time a new episode gets posted. And this show's called Radio Mysterioso with Greg Bishop. Now, I kind of discovered this one by reading a book, and it was, I had heard something about a book on a podcast, and I picked the book up, checked it out, read it, loved it. The book was called Project Beta. And without boring everyone, you can find out more information about that online. But he hosted his own podcast. So I started listening to it, and I was just floored. I mean, just well-spoken, very educated guy, and just made me think more than I had ever thought about the whole thing of aliens, abduction, UFOs, strange. It just, my mind was even opened more by this guy. And I so appreciate Greg and his podcast and his writing and his books. And I love everything that he does. And he's an awesome guy. And I appreciate the podcast that he does. Then this kind of opened me up to another guy named Tim Banal, who does a podcast called Banal of America. And this was kind of my door opening into other things UFO, meaning like ghosts and paranormal and Bigfoot, of course. Yeah, Bigfoot. Don't get me started with Bigfoot. But he also had an interesting way of thinking about things and explaining things and asking questions of his guests. And it got you thinking. And this is what I was really starting to really love about podcasting was not only was I learning something, but it was also kind of training me to think different ways, that things just aren't what we think they are. And that can be applied to any part of life. I mean, it's a different way to think about things and just kind of analyze what's going on around you. Sometimes things are as simple as they seem. Sometimes they're not, but that's another good podcast that really kind of opened my mind. Speaking of open minds, Open Minds UFO Radio with Alejandro Rojas. Now, this was a really cool one because it's like a news show. He starts it off as a news show, so it was always like, what's the top for this week? What have been the top reports that have been coming in? And let's talk about them. And recently, within the past year or so, he brought in Martin Willis from Podcast UFO as his news guy. So the two of them discuss news stories and vice versa. They go on each other's shows and they talk. And it got a good chemistry, so it's really cool. But yeah, I always liked his show too. He always has really good guests and very informative. Then that led me to another podcast called The Paracast with Gene Steinberg and Christopher O'Brien. Now, Gene is an old school broadcaster, an old school UFO guy, and Christopher O'Brien is just a really great field researcher who's done tons of research on cattle mutilations. So he's the guy if you want to talk about cattle mutilations, and he's got some really cool projects coming up. Great podcast. Can't stand the commercials. So, if you want to get some really good information, that's awesome podcast, but be warned, lots of commercials. Then this opened me up to another podcast called Hidden Experience with Mike Clellan. Now, Mike Clellan is awesome. Great dude, just put his first book out, and I can't recommend this podcast enough. Once again, this is a podcast that's kind of come in and out. It's, he gets a lot of releases and then he takes a lot of time off. And I know he's writing a book and everything, and it's called The Messengers. And it's about pretty much, and his podcast pretty much revolves around the synchronicity of owls and alien abduction. And once again, you're niching down to like such a specific topic, and it's interesting to hear it from a different perspective. It's not just, flying saucers flying around, aliens coming, but there's something else going on out there that he noticed was going on that probably everyone else didn't, but kind of brought it to the attention of everyone else. And then everyone, as they think back, oh, you know what? I do remember this. I do remember that. And he's somehow like just opening up this whole new door in the world of ufology, I guess, and with bringing owls and UFOs and alien abduction together. So if you're into that, that's a cool one to check out too. Then that leads me to my last one about pretty much that. It's called The Grayling Report with Micah Hanks. Now, Micah Hanks is an awesome dude, and he's a huge guy that's really into promoting podcasting and the quality of podcasts, and just awesome talker. The guy could just talk your ear off, but his shows are really great. I mean, awesome structure. They come out every week. He just has this certain, you listen to him and you just get so engrossed into how he talks and the way he talks and the stuff he talks about. It's just, it really gets you thinking about a lot of cool things and stuff. So once again, check out The Grayling Report with Micah Hanks. But like I said, I got to a point where I was just listening. I mean, like literally I could listen to 4, 5, 6, 7 hours of podcasting every day, Monday through Friday. So, I mean, that's like 4,000 hours a week. But once again, my math's not that good. And, just taking in all this information, and then like I'd come home, read, and it was just getting a little overwhelming to me. And I was like, come on, I got to open my horizons a little bit. So I'm like, the Bigfoot thing. I'm like, the Bigfoot thing is all bullshit, I think. And I still can't get my fingers around it. And so I'm like, well, maybe I'll find a podcast that'll kind of change my mind about that. So I started looking out towards the Bigfoot way, trying to be open-minded. And I found this podcast called Sasquatch, a podcast about Bigfoot. And it's hosted by a guy named Seth Breedlove. And the more I researched this podcast and listened to it and everything, I'm like, oh, he's talking about all these familiar places and locations, and like, holy cow, he like lives 45 minutes from me. Like, to me, I'm like, wow, I can really relate to this guy. Like, and he's talking about these movies that he's making and all these other things other than a Bigfoot. But if you're into Bigfoot, definitely check out Sasquatch. The next show that I got introduced to was Where Did the Road Go with Soraya Azkath. And this is a great show because he has a lot of really cool guests and stuff like that. And he talks about things in a little different way than everyone else. And he has a lot of good co-hosts on there and stuff, and has a lot of the same guests, but they always have these very interesting, in-depth and thoughtful conversations about whether or not, this thing's true or that thing's true. Mostly UFO or abduction things, but also throws in paranormal stuff too. And I find it very interesting. So then that brings me to a podcast called Into the Fray. Now, this podcast came out a little over a year ago. I think they were just celebrating their year anniversary. And about a little over a year ago, probably in the middle of last summer, 2015, I had toyed around with the idea. By this point, I'm like, I'm listening to all these podcasts. Maybe now's the time I should do something. And as I'm thinking about, I'm like, podcasting, well, what do I know about it? I mean, I like listening to them. I've had a broadcast history. What could I do? So I started to think about something I could possibly podcast about. And I'm like, oh, I'll podcast about UFOs. I'm like, I know so much stuff about it, and I could probably speak kind of intelligently about it or entertaining about it, because there really weren't a lot of like quote unquote fun or funny type of podcasts about UFOs. And you got to, when you're thinking of an idea for a show, you kind of got to think of something different. And with there being all these podcasts about the same thing, you got to really think outside of the box. And I didn't want to go in like pissing anyone off, like trying to think that I'm making a joke about it, but I'm like, you got to be a little bit more lighthearted about it, because not everyone is so hardcore into it. And as people are learning more about it, I think it kind of loosens the grip around the throat, where it's not all about space aliens coming visiting Earth. It could be just, let's loosen up a little bit. It could be something more like something that's just happening, But so as I thought about this, I'm like, all right, my friend and I, Josh, we're like, we're going to do a podcast all about UFOs, Bigfoot, paranormal, and we're going to bring guests in and discuss all these different things about it. And as I'm getting ready, preparing, building a website and everything, I'm getting ready to do this. I'm all excited. We're getting all this stuff. We're getting all this information and things to talk about together. And boom, drops a podcast called Into the Fray with Shannon LeGros, Ryan Sprague, and Sam Sheridan. Now, awesome podcast, but it knocked me off my high horse because I was like, shit, this is the show I wanted to do. And they literally, like within weeks, launched the same show that I wanted to do. And they are doing an awesome job. I love their show. Great show. Listen to it. Once again, I'll put a link up to it, but they knocked me off my horse. I was like, oh man, now what am I going to do? So I kind of was deflated for a second. I'm like, I don't even know what I know about more than anyone else. So I kind of decided that I was going to take this time to like really engross myself with, this is it. I'm going to make the commitment to actually do my own show, to be a podcaster, to do it right, to do it about something I knew about. And I would figure that out as I went along. But I'm like, I'm going to take this time to just really consume as much material as I can to learn how to podcast and how to do it right. So I kind of like wiped the slate of the UFO thing, and I'm going to find all these podcasts about podcasting. So I started downloading all these, subscribing, and just listening. And I couldn't, once again, get enough. And the thing is when you're trying to learn something, like even if you're going to college or school or whatever, you sit in a classroom all day and you're reading stuff and you're listening to the teacher talk and taking notes and stuff like that. And it just can get really boring. And for me, I can't learn that way. And podcasting really just kind of was like that. This is it. This is exactly how I learn. This is how I need to learn. And that to me is another benefit of podcasting. It is the only way that I can really absorb material is by listening to it. And the fact that I can do it all day long while I'm working and making money, making a living is even a bonus. So I started looking for these podcasts, and the first one I really came across was called The Podcast Studio and Quick Tips with Ray Ortega. Now, just as I praised Martin Willis and Podcast UFO for being that show that really propelled me into the world of podcasting, I want to thank Ray for propelling me into the world of podcasting. Like, he's really the guy that set me ablaze with like, oh my God, this guy gets me. I'm like, I get everything he's saying. Oh my God, I actually have a lot of the same equipment that he's, saying that we need to use or he uses or whatever. And I'm like, oh, so, I can really relate to this guy. I feel like Ray's like my soulmate when it comes to podcasting. And so I started consuming as much stuff as I could by him. And I'm finding more of these other podcasts that he does, the Podcasters Roundtable with Daniel J. Lewis and Dave Jackson. And I'm just listening to all this stuff and I'm learning so much, like how to do this, how to do that, how to edit, how to interview, the equipment I needed. And I was just getting super excited about it. And to boot, these guys also did YouTube channels. So they were presenting a podcast about podcasting, but then they were also presenting a visual aspect of the equipment. And, this is what it looks like. This is how it works. This is how you plug it in. And that to me was like, it completed the circle for why I needed to podcast. and I'd found everything I needed just from that podcast. And like I said, the one podcast had two other hosts, Daniel J. Lewis and Dave Jackson, and both of those guys had their own podcasts. So I'm like, oh, so let's go down those roads. So I started listening to the School of Podcasting with Dave Jackson. Once again, I find out, crap, this guy lives like half an hour from me. And so I start looking into him more, and he has a podcast meetup group. So I decided to go to one of the meetings on a Saturday afternoon, and lo and behold, there's Chris Kremitzos and his crew shooting a documentary called The Messengers, all about podcasting. And meeting those guys, and we ended up going out to dinner, and Daniel J. Lewis was there from the Audacity to Podcast, and we all just kind of sat around and talked. And I was hearing the story about them making this movie that's going to be debuted in February. I was just getting even more and more enthralled with podcasting. By this point, I've already put shows out and stuff, but that's just where that tangent led me to by listening to that one podcast. It kind of like taught me more, and then it led me into a podcast meetup, and then it led me to meeting all these really awesome people in real life. I mean, it just wasn't a online thing where you guys are sending messages back and forth about questioning about gear or how do you do this. It was, hey, let's meet up and like actually talk in person. Let's have a relationship, which that is another aspect of podcasting that's what it can lead to. So once again, that's another two podcasts that you should check out: the School of Podcasting with Dave Jackson and the Audacity to Podcast with Daniel J. Lewis. Another podcast that really got me into podcasting was A Podcast Method with Dan Benjamin. Now, he really explained a lot of the technology and did a lot of back and forth stuff with equipment, so I was able to like kind of decipher like, maybe I don't need to go as hardcore into equipment. Maybe my ATR 2100 and my Zoom H6 is all I need. And that's what I sit with now. Those are my two main things. I got a couple Shure SM58s that I use when I go out and interview people, and a couple other rinky-dink things. But the one thing I guess I do regret that when I first started was buying a mixer. I bought a 6-channel mixer, and I don't need it. It's sitting there not doing anything. My Zoom H6 does everything I could possibly want it to do, plus more, and I love it, and it records great sound. Couldn't ask for a better thing to use for podcasting. So all of that pretty much leads up to me launching my podcast at the beginning of this year. January 1st, 2016, I launched the Beardcaster Podcast, had an episode recorded, and I just kind of went from there. I was terrified to release. I mean, I wanted to release in November, but at that time I was like still trying to figure out like what I wanted to do. And I kind of sat there, and I don't remember my epiphany moment, but it was kind of like that. It might have been Ray Ortega saying, do a podcast about something but they all say that. And I'm like thinking, what do I really know? What have I really experienced in my life that I feel like I'm an expert about? And I kind of thought, I'm like, well, shit, I've been growing a beard since like 2000. And, I've always had it long. I've had all these really wacky experiences as I've had it for all these years. And then it kind of turned into like a whole different thing once I got into competitive bearding about 4 or 5 years ago. And then that turned into a whole bunch of different things. And I've met all these really incredible people and amazing people and had all these really awesome experiences. And my perspective of everything's just been really changed. And then I was like, maybe that's what I can talk about, because that whole experience really has changed who I am now. And maybe those are the stories that I can tell to people out there that are guys that are growing or girls that are interested in, doing fake bearding because their, boyfriend's really into it and they're trying to find a way to be involved in it. Or your kids or whatever, doing the fake beards and doing family types of events and stuff. But that's where my mind went. It was, how can I, let me see if I can do a podcast about all of that. And then the name just kind of came to me, the Beardcaster. And next thing I know, I'm like looking online to see if the domain's open, and yeah, it is. So I buy the domain, I throw a website together, like literally effortlessly. And it just kind of all happened. And I was more terrified about like the recording process, which wasn't that bad. And then the editing process scared the shit out of me, but then that wasn't too bad. And then the uploading process scared the shit out of me again. And then that wasn't, sorry about that noisy car going by, but that scared me too, but it wasn't that bad. And as I'm 9 months into this, it's all pretty darn easy at this point, and I wish I would have started years ago. But the scene is still growing, and there's still a lot of new podcasts coming out, and there's still a lot of really great new shows out there for everyone to check out. As I've been on this journey for the past 9 months, I've kind of, my thoughts about everything have kind of changed. My ideas for what I wanted the show to be originally have changed, and it's still a work in progress. My intentions when I first started in radio were never to be a broadcaster. I was not a good broadcaster the first time I did it. I was really not a good broadcaster the second time I did it, and I'm still not a good broadcaster now, but at least I have the benefit of editing, whereas on live radio, you can't. So I have the benefit of that, so I can eliminate my ums and my breaks and my, little F-ups here and there. But for the most part, I am not a broadcaster. I'm just a guy talking about fun stories about beards and telling fun little adventures that we've had, or talking about a competition that's coming up with whoever's putting it on, because I think that it's important that people learn about it. And the reasons why we do all this stuff is always for the good of someone else. It's always done for a charity. It's always done for helping someone out. And that's why I really feel that my message is important, because I'm just trying to spread the word of other people that are trying to do other cool things, and to try to help them promote their message of who they're trying to help out, or how they're trying to help you out. Like, for instance, like a beard oil company. I mean, I haven't done, I think one episode about beard oil, but there's going to be more coming up, because everyone that I've talked to over the past year has their whole different idea and thoughts about the importance of beard oil and beard care. And to me, I think that, the more people I can talk to about their ideas and their thoughts and what they've experienced and what they feel is the best information they have, could be that to you, the best information that you have about that. So I'm just trying to find all different types of people involved in all different things. It's not always going to be about beard competitions, or it's not always going to be about beard care, but it's always going to be beard related or mustache related. I feel like sometimes I leave the mustache guys out, and I apologize for that. When I say bearding, I include that into the whole thing. So my apologies to the mustache guys. So I wrote this little thing to kind of talk about what my podcast is and why pretty much you should listen to it. So this is me pretty much for International Podcasting Day telling you to check out this podcast, which that's really stupid because you're already listening to it right now. But this is going to the people who are listening to it and me asking them, tell someone about it. If you're a bearded guy, you have bearded friends. Let them know about it. So this is what I wrote. I want to provide content that is rich and advantageous to a listener. And the value I try to provide to the people that listen to my podcast is this: learning. I want them to learn about something they may not know about. I want them to learn about something that they have been part of for a long time and that they just discovered. Now, that kind of sounds weird in itself, because if you've been a part of something and you're now just discovering it, but that's my story. I had a beard forever and ever and ever, and I never knew about beard competitions. Shit, I had no idea. And one day, something popped up on my Facebook feed that said, hey, beard competition. So I looked into it, and I went and showed up, and I won. And that was like the hook that was in my back that pulled me into the whole competitive beard world. And once again, it was something that I knew about. I mean, I knew how to grow a beard. It was something that I had experienced for a long time, but I just didn't know that there was more to it. And discovering that more to it was the thing that changed my life, because it wasn't just that getting annoyed every 5 minutes when someone was like, hey, the ZZ Top guy, or hey, have you watched the Duck Dynasty show? it wasn't that anymore. It was turning into like responsible and good relationships with good people, with good heads on their shoulders, who were doing good things for other people. And, just coincidentally, we all have beards and mustaches, and we all get together and drink beer and, have a good time. So that's what I meant by discovering that. I want you to learn how to take care of yourself. I want you to learn how to take care of that wonderful man on your face. I want you to learn about the people that need help and how those in the facial hair world help them out. I want them to learn about being free in public and to be able to blow off the scrutiny and judgmental eyes of so many people that are out there that look at us like we're trash or biker trash or we're going to mug them or something like that. That's just not how we are. And that's what I want to help people deal with, to get past. I want you to learn to do something. I want you to be inspired to try something new. I want you to laugh at everything, and I don't want you to be so serious. And I just relax and be yourself. That's what I want you to take from this podcast. I don't want it to be always serious. It's going to be fun. It's going to be goofy. And that's what the Beardcaster podcast is all about. So for this International Podcast Day, I'm going to end this whole discussion with how I got to where I'm at, and I'm going to leave it with just share it with someone else. My message to you for International Podcast Day is tell someone about a podcast that you enjoy. Tell someone about a podcast that's made a difference in your life. Tell someone about a podcast that has changed your life. And like I said, I know this isn't International Podcast Day today, but every day that you find something that changes your life so much is a day that you should share that with someone else. So that's my final thoughts on all of this. And I'm going to leave you with that. So once again, I'd like to thank everyone that's listened so far. I'd like to thank everyone that's subscribed. I'd like to send out a special shout out to Sean Hansen of Manhood Beard Company and Dennis Meskel for listening and supporting. And I do this for you guys. You guys have really, made me feel good with your kind words and everything, and I greatly appreciate it. I'd also like to thank, I got reached out to by a new oil company called Pulpo Beard Oils. And you can find them at Pulpo Beard Oils. That's a tough one to say. But once again, links in the show notes. You can go check their stuff out. He sent me a whole bunch of oils to check out, and they've been nothing but amazing. The Red Alert and the Four Horsemen are fantastic. So if you're listening to this right now and you're looking for an oil, once again, check out pulpobeardoils.com. Red Alert and Four Horsemen. Those are the two I recommend to you right now, but you'll be hearing more about them coming up in the future. I'd like to thank my friend Matt at Waffender Whisker Oil for being awesome and just a great guy that's helped me develop this show to where I want it to be. I've spent many hours with him at shows, with him at his oil table, helping promote his oil and getting people interested in the product that he provides, which is amazing. Not only for men, but for women and their skin. And it's not just a hair care product, it's a skin care product. So Waffender Whisker Oil, check them out. I'd also like to thank Anna and Brutal Beards. Once again, another awesome oil company, local company out of Cleveland. I love your stuff. I love everything about you. Keep up everything you do, and everyone needs to check Anna out and Brutal Beards. And I'd also like to thank Groomed Gorilla, who's been so gracious for everything they've done with me and for me in the past year. And keep up the good work, guys. And again, if you want to try out some new oils, check out any four of those companies. So thank you again. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. And please feel free to email me at scott@thebeardcaster.com and send me any thoughts. I mean, if you thought this episode was a little too wordy, please email me and be like, dude, don't ever do another episode where it's just you talking about something. It was horrible. I want to know this. I love talking to people. I'd rather do an interview with someone one-on-one, but this just so happened to fall at a very important time, with it being International Podcast Day, that I figured I wanted to take the time to actually talk about that. And I wanted to actually talk to another podcaster, which there are two of them. I was trying to set up something with Colin from a podcast called Attack of the Beards, and I wanted to talk to him about podcasting and stuff, but he ended up, was his anniversary, so him and his wife went on vacation for the week, and he was going to be in the mountains, so that didn't work. And then the other guy I reached out to was Drunkle Dan from the Drunken Book Nerd podcast, or the Drunken Beardsman podcast. Now this would have been perfect to have him on my show because he's from Australia. So International Podcasting Day means it's all over the world. So that's the one cool thing about podcasting is it's all encompassing the whole entire planet. So him and I, we're dealing with a 14-hour time difference, him being in Australia and me being here in Cleveland, Ohio. So it was going to be very difficult for us to actually meet up. And I think he ended up getting eaten by a dingo or something because we kind of messaged back and forth, and then that was the last I heard from him. So, but you will definitely be hearing from Dan at some point. So when you hear that Australian guy on the show, you'll know exactly who it is. So check his podcast out too, once again, in the show notes. So thank you again to everyone who's made it this far in. This is probably one of the lengthiest episodes I've done to date, and it's just all me talking, so hopefully I didn't bore you to death. So thanks again, and everyone have a great week. And last thing, share a podcast with something, explore something, and let something change you for the better. Thank you, and good night.